think, Antal, you are going to hand the microphone.
A little bit louder, if you can.
Yes, we are going to collect a set of questions in the public.
Kondusi Andreához szeretnék hozzászólni egy kérdésem. Egy kérdésem lenne, és egy kritikai módszertani megjegyzésem. A kérdés az az, hogy a társadalmi egyenlőség gondolatával egyetértünk, de most ezt a gender szituációja konkrétizálva az a javaslata hangzott el, hogy a meg nem fizetett munkát kell megfizetni. Na már most a család egy olyan mikroközösség, ahol nemek és nemzedékeknek a kölcsönösségi viszony áll fel. Reciprocitások, Polányit is ide hozzuk nyilván, és ahhoz, hogy a meg nem fizetettet megfizettetté tegyük, ahhoz áruviszonyként kellene létrehozni azt a kapcsolatot, ami a kölcsönösségen van. Na most a kölcsönösség persze lehet olyan véletlen család, amiről Dostoyevsky ír, széthullik és a nemzedékek egymásra esnek, de lehet olyan család is, amiről Tolsztoj ír, ami demokratikus berendezkedési abban a szempontból nem feltétlenül hierarchikus és patriarchális. Tehát az igazi kérdés az nem hiszem, hogy fizetetté kellene tenni, mert akkor bevezetjük az áruviszonyt, már pedig nagyon sok szempontból az áruviszonyokon való túlkerülés egyik célja a szocialista gondolatnak. Tehát én azt gondolom, hogy egyébként is lehetetlen, mert hiszen a nemzedékek közötti kapcsolatban, amit a szülő a gyermeknek tudást ezer módon ad át, a mimézisztől kezdve azon keresztül, hogy tanít délután, azt a gyereke a saját gyerekének fogja átadni, és nem a szülőjének adja vissza. Tehát itt nagyon komoly problémák vannak, hogyha a családon belüli társadalmi egyenlőtlenségek kiküszöbölését, azt a munka megfizetésével akarnánk elérni. A kritikai megjegyzése már bizonyos fokig össze is lehetne kötni ezzel a problémával, de kíváncsi vagyok az ön válaszára, hogy látja áthidalhatónak a munka megfizetésével a családon belül a társadalmi egyenlőség elérését, mert ez a kérdés. Na most a másik az az, hogy a kapitalizmusban nem a munkát vásárolja meg a tőkés a munkástól, hanem a szellemi és fizikai munkavégző képességét. A munkát akkor vesznek és kényszerítenek, amikor a prekapitalista módozatokról van szó, robotról, 9-edről, 10-edről, első éjszaka jogáról, vagy napjainkban szexrabszolgaságról és egyéb kényszermunkákról, de az értéktöbblettermelés, és nem terméktöbblet, hanem értéktöbblettermelés, az a munkavégző képesség, mert a munkás a tőkés parancsnoklása és irányítása alatt végzi, amit végez, és nem a saját jó akaratából, és nem a saját célra. Véleményem szerint a francia marxista Nikos Poulanyi a 70-es években tökéletesen megoldotta már azt a problémát, hogy minden konkrét, létező társadalmi-gazdasági alakulat, tehát térben és időben létezik valami, az több termelési mód és forma együttélése. Nem egy termelési mód a kapitalizmus se sohasem, ilyen tiszta forma az absztrakció szintén van, hogy megértsük a konkrétat. A gondolati konkrét azonban kifejeződése a reális konkrétumnak, tehát különösebb probléma azzal nincs, hogy van uralkodó termelési mód, és mellette még egész sereg alárendelt termelési mód és forma. Tehát én szerintem ez egy módszertani kérdés, és az előadásban ezek a szintek összecsúsztak, hogy most én teoretikusan akarom átvilágítani a létezőt, vagy a létezőnek egy konkrét alakzatát akarom vizsgálni, amikor is ezt az úgynevezett, hogy az ön kifejezésével éljek, munka pluralitását, számomra problematikus kifejezés politökonomiai szempontból, tehát ezt a két dolgot szerintem az előadásban keveredve találtuk, és ez nekem nagyon tetszett.
Thank you. Can everyone keep in mind to keep it short so that everyone can speak, because I see the hands are raised here.
I would like to pose a question to Andre. Why do you find important to redefine Marx's concept of value so that it could contain unpaid labor, and we can consider the natural resources in this context as a creative component of value. Why should we do it, and why not to keep Marx's concept of value? I have in mind David Harvey's argument for keeping Marx's concept of value. You can argue for your position against the background of Harvey's arguments.
Thank you. Maybe one more.
Yes, I see the time point, so I reduce the things. And sorry for I have questions to everybody, but now I'm going to pose two to Gerrit because of time constraint. One is that I think I like your question, what Polanyi would say about the refugee crisis. That's a very good question. I think from an East European point of view, he would develop the idea of a popular revolt against the fictitious exchange of fictitious migrant labor. So this super abstract thing that, let me put it this way, so that Eastern Europe providing an enormous amount of emigrant labor, at the same time being afraid of receiving immigrant labor, right? And then I think the rejection is against this kind of a mechanic exchange, which some of the investors, some of the even global organizations like OECD would be happy to see, right? That would be, I think, a Polanyian kind of an answer to your question. But I think I love it because, yes, in terms of history of Polanyi, that's important. The second one, is it okay now? I hope that the question was already okay. The second one is actually the title of the panel. Karl Marx and Karl Polanyi, right? And I think you have written very nicely about the various possibilities of interpreting Karl Polanyi from a Marxist point of view. And then, you know, some people saying that basically Karl Polanyi was following Marx. Some people were saying that it was moving apart. Then they were saying that in certain parts it's moving this way, sometimes moving that way. He was just a moral economist, and so on and so on and so on. But I think, for me, the key question is the following concerning Polanyi, because it's not just a question of history of ideas. I think what comes out of the Polanyian thinking is that all societies are balanced in case there are various forms of integrations of economy and society, right? This cannot be put into hierarchy. This is what Polanyi always taught. And that could be some kind of an ideal form. So in case you look at what he wrote about anti-economy, what he wrote about all these things, he was saying that even in the Roman Empire there was a balance between redistribution and market, and so on and so on. But is it possible in capitalism? That's the key question. Is there a possibility of a mixed economy in capitalism? And I think in case we follow this kind of a line, that in the end, he ends up together with Karl Marx, that within capitalism, that's impossible to have a mixed economy, because capitalism is a totalizing market expansion. It cannot be stopped. That's actually related to Andrea's lecture as well. But I really would like to see your position on this, writing, you know, so much about Polanyi and then these things. These are the two questions. I hope they were not too time-consuming.
Mine would be very, very short. I just wanted to connect the two sessions, and I wanted to discuss with Andrea that the quotation that she used in her presentation about British India, British rule in India. This is from the Marx preface from 1867. So the problem that I have with this interpretation, and in particular Utter Frank and others, is that they don't know that Marx continued to elaborate his thoughts. And after 1867, there are 15 more years of research, of this international kind of research, and Marx said that that sentence was wrong, and when he wrote the French translation of Capital, he wrote the other one, so the other Marx that I provided in my presentation. And I also wanted to ask you, Serkan, what he believes was very interesting in the presentation, I liked it. What do you believe of Schalin interpretation of Marx? You quoted Schalin, Theodor Schalin many times, and he said that there is a turn, so there is always this idea that every time we discover a new page of Marx, there is a new author. I don't agree with the fact that Marx is completely changing his idea, right? So I said that socialism is always something that is related to some capitalist development. Schalin, on the contrary, said that there is a turn, a dramatic turn in this method to this way. So this was my question for you. Thanks.
I'm sorry. Sorry?
Would you like to start?
I don't mind. Tell us.
Go ahead.
Me.
Yeah.
Okay. The question on wages for housework wasn't applied to me, but I reckon, I think there are problems with that formulation. The question about wages for housework wasn't applied for me. That wasn't intended for me, so I'm not going to say anything apart from this. I think there are all sorts of problems with that formulation, but it was the way I understood it. It's asking the state to pay in the same way that the state pays for all sorts of other projects, including unemployment benefit and so on. That doesn't commodify the unemployed people, so I'm not sure that pretty quite holds water. But as to the question to me, Polanyi, what would you say about the refugee crisis? It's a fascinating question. I don't know. Okay, so there are some Polanyans who argue that immigration control is a socially protective defense against foreign labor power, which is a fictitious commodity. I think I would prefer to reverse that, turn it on its head. I think immigration control is a fictitious protection against labor power as a commodity, the import of labor power as a commodity. I don't think it's a protection that works. It's just immigration control just reinforces the racist divisions which help constitute a differentiated form of differentiated working class worldwide on which capitalism thrives. Now, would Polanyi follow that particular one of his? Would Polanyi agree with that particular one of his followers who I've just quoted? I don't know. It's hard to say. He was, I set up an opposition between Marx and Polanyi, and it was a bit of a caricature, to be honest. It was for the sake of argument. You see, Marx and Engels were, as I think it was Andrea pointed out, were quite capable of coming out with very odious racist stuff, particularly in their early years. I mean, the impressive thing about Marx and Engels is that they really learned over the course of their lives, as Kevin Anderson has brought out most brilliantly in Marx at the Margins. And they became much more consistently anti-racist towards the end of their lives. Polanyi, however, Polanyi was excellent in his anti-racism in some respects, but he was very sneery about the Eastern Jews, for example, who came into Hungary, immigrating labor powers, well, they're refugees actually, fleeing pogroms in Russia. He was very scornful and disdainful of those groups. And so one could fear that he would buy into some of the similar disdain that is exhibited towards other incomers from the East today. So I think it's an open question with Polanyi. The difficulty, the more serious answer is that the difficulty, where I have a problem with the development of his thought, is that he responded to the great catastrophe in which he was involved at the First World War by engaging in a process of radicalization in which he moved towards very radical positions around guild socialism. But his radicalism only extended to the relationship between economy and society, and he never really developed a radical critique of the state. And that, even in his guild socialist phase, and that meant that he was, as the heat of those, as the fires of those revolutions in which he was involved in the late teens and early 20s, those fires faded, he drifted towards a Fabianism that was very much standard patriotic, nationalistic, state-supporting social democracy of the mainstream time. So I've not really answered your question. I've really just formulated some of the contradictions in his thought. Your second question, I'll be briefer on this. Polanyi argued all societies are balanced. Well, he didn't, as you know, he didn't. So I must have misunderstood you. He didn't argue that capitalist society is balanced. It's very much imbalanced in his view. Every other society is balanced in his view. Right, that's what you were saying. Okay, good. But I don't find that formulation particularly helpful because the balance for him concerns redistribution, reciprocity, and market exchange, which are forms of distribution. He never looked at processes of production which require that one looks at. Sorry, by process of production, I'm really looking at relations of production, relations of exploitation and power relations that go along with that. He was blind to class, really, for much of his life, apart from a brief period in the 20s and 30s where he developed quite an interesting theory of the mapping of a crisis of democracy to questions of class struggle. So he didn't look at class and power relations, which I think is one of the major weaknesses in his argument. And he might, therefore, as you suggest, have developed a radical, maintained a radical anti-capitalist critique. There are some very important interpretations of Polanyi that are recovering him as a radical socialist from the mainstream Polanyans who've rebranded him, reinterpreted him as essentially a right-wing social democrat. But where and I'll finish on this, where you say he developed an analysis of capitalism as a totalizing phenomenon, I don't think he was able to quite consistently do that because he had no concept of capital or of capital accumulation. And if capitalism is a totalizing phenomenon of social system, it can never totalize completely. There's always an outside of capitalism, but it tends to totality or to totalization. But that is because of the drive of capital itself. And if you don't have a concept of capital, it's hard to ground that totalizing dynamic. I'll leave it at that.
Alexander. Yeah.
Yes. Like this Theodor Schanin, in my point of view, is very much bounded to the agrarian question in discussing on or attributing such traits to Marx, especially such a radical shift in Marx thought at a certain time. So, and for me, it is based on his background, academic background, and his accounts on. So, for me, I cannot put a linear line on Marx thoughts. So since I'm not dealing with historiopolitical thought, I'm not coming from this discipline, but rather the primary focus of Marx has been this problematizing the class society and how to overcome capitalism. So it is much, especially in the writings about in the political writings of Marx and this writings of late Marx. He is much more interested in dealing with this specific topic and right after receiving feedbacks about the capital. And so this is and especially it was the point when he found himself forced to say that the capital was a book that only can only be understood in the context of Western Europe. So it wasn't offering a sort of like prescription that it has to be, this historical development has to happen in that way, in that particular time. And it can be easily seen in most of the contemporaries of Karl Marx, like this. But the Paris Commune had a very significant effect on the thoughts of all these important communists, like including the anarchist communists who gonna call themselves in this label. But like for me, it is not that like this Marx, the shifts in Marx thought is not very much, like well formulated as he did in Capital, like well thought. For instance, it is also mentioned in Shanin's work. He offers, for instance, this Federation of Peasants Commune. And it is like, it appears to me like a very kind of like random term coined by Marx in his letter, because he was very much into learning a lot, like learning much more about the Russian context, since there was a growing revolutionary movement, and the basic question was this: whether we can overcome socialism, whether we can achieve socialism without just going through this capitalist development. And I'm also not agree with like Shanin's framework, because he is very much into creating such a binary thinking in Marx thought, like between this agrarian versus industrial. So especially, it is not very much, for me, Marx's thoughts on this revolution is much more flexible, rather than just putting these two, let's say, subjectivities, like agrarian, like the peasants and working class. And Russian road cannot be discussed merely within the context of agrarian, like Russia is agrarian society. So yeah, for me, I do not share Shanin's vision on Marx, this radical shift in his thoughts. Suddenly he became very much interested in this agrarian question and shifted from all these industrial framework. So yeah, it would be my answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You have the last word for the responses. Do we have time for another round later, or do we have to close it?
Thank you. Thank you for your question about paying housework or paying unpaid work. No, I didn't say that I want unpaid work to be paid. That was a misunderstanding or your interpretation. Under capitalism, it is appropriated. That was my argument. But it's absolutely not my position, and that I argue for commodifying the reciprocal work. On the contrary, I think if I accept this coexistence of reciprocal and commodified work, I would enlarge the stance of the reciprocal work by extending it at the expense of paid work, and find a new combination which to my mind is necessary in order to have a more equal distribution of work and labor in the society. The point that capital buys capacities and not the workers, you are completely right. Of course, it is also buying their time, and the time you can. So this is a little bit more than the capacities, but maybe a solution would be not to speak of buying, but of hiring. Capital is hiring the workers for a certain time in which they can be used. And referring to Poulantzas, with whom I'm not very familiar, but obviously I share his position that all modes and systems show a combination of work and labor relations. But under capitalism, there's of course one work and labor relation, a privileged one. It's the commodified work, and the commodified work is subordinating the other works and work and labor relations and appropriates or exploits them. Yeah? But with regard to the non-paid work in households and subsistence agriculture and so on, one precondition is a devaluation of that work. Yeah? It is defined as non-work. Yeah? If you look how wage labor became common under the industrial system, housework was created, the housewife was created, and her work that she continued to do as she did in the subsistence in the domestic economy was not regarded as work anymore, but as her natural duty as wife and mother. So this devaluation are the grounds for their exploitation, for their hidden exploitation, because if it's not work, then how can you appropriate it? So it disappears from the debate, as it did disappear from the Marxist debate until feminists regained it. And I want to point out that this contribution of this unpaid work to value production creates value, and if you take this for serious, then of course this is an enormous challenge to the Marxist theory of value, and this is also the answer that I cannot keep up this theory of value, because I have a completely different interpretation of value. Of course, in a certain set of let's say parameters, also this other theory makes sense, but it's a clash, and you cannot reconcile it. I think you have to decide for this or that interpretation of value. Yeah, I mean, Marcello is of course much better in reading the latest works of Marx. I also read a little bit of it, but not too much. But I mean, shall we only quote the late Marx? No, I mean, we have to see Marx in his developments. And if we quote, we always take out quotes. And I mean, Marx is so full of contradictions. Maybe you can, if you are really Marxologist, as you seem to be, then you of course can bring a narrative into these contradictions. But otherwise, I have the impression Marx is very useful for us, because you can use him in this and that way. And I'm one of those who are not as firm as you, so I also allow me to take quotes from an earlier period. Yeah, so that's my comments on Marx. Just 2 sentences, because I cannot refrain from stating. I would define immigration control as a continuation of labor mobilization by destroying the means of sustenance of the people who are mobilized. But the same is true for open borders.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm sorry this is a bit shorter than it could have been, but we started late. The important point Antal told me is that we can continue talking in the reception right now already. Thank you.